Hello, class. Today we're going to be doing a discussion over Georgia's role in the Revolutionary War. In my opinion, this area of Revolutionary history and in Georgia history is overlooked quite a lot. And I believe that this is because it is the shadow. It stays under the shadow of the northern colonies and all the events that took place up in Maryland and Boston and all these areas that took place outside of the southern states. But during the Revolutionary period, Georgia did not have a large involvement. Compared to some of the other colonies, Georgia was still a relatively young colony, and it really recently been established. Because of this, Georgia needed to rely on British support. Georgia needed to really rely on help from the British, because there was a there was a lot of native attacks during this time. Because as you know, that wherever the Europeans go, they cause issues with Aboriginal people. They cause issues with the natives. The people there just did not like the people of Georgia taking their land and taking everything that was theirs before. But they still need to rely on that British protection. We got to understand that, because it really delays what happens with Georgia and the direction that Georgia goes in this war. This was the last colony to be established, as I said, and they needed to have British protection from the native hostiles. This began to change when the British started to focus more on keeping the Georgians under their thumb. In Because Georgia really never agreed with what the British were doing. The British, they didn't like that the British were taxing and doing all these other things to the colonists, but the Georgians' hands were tied. They couldn't do anything about it because they needed to have the British support. They needed to make sure that they could have that kind of help. But they were on the wrong side. They couldn't do anything. They were between a rock and a hard place. They just had issues. But one thing we'll be discussing in this is the most important battle that occurred in Georgia, which is the Battle of Kettle Creek. And it's one of the most important battles in Revolutionary American history, and it is the most important battle in Georgia history. And this battle was able to push the Loyalists back to Savannah, where they would ultimately stay until the end of the war. But when we discuss Revolutionary America, our minds automatically go to the northern colonies. But the Revolutionary War was not just isolated in the northern colonies. Georgia's role was different, much different than South Carolina's role, or Maryland's role, or Massachusetts' role, or New York's role. It was completely different. And we got to look at it. We got to understand it, that it was completely different. But we can't just shut out the southern colonies because they didn't have as much of an impact. But as we'll see, is Georgia had their own struggles. They had their own issues to deal with before they could jump into the Revolutionary War. They had to deal with the native attacks. As I said before, first being the really youngest and colony down below, it was established for Great Britain to be a military buffer for the Spanish, and really just there as a buffer state. So they never really had that opportunity of growing and trying to build up like all the other colonies. So they had to have that reliance on Great Britain, which delayed the inevitable that they tried to get into the Revolutionary War. But one book that I found that really explains so much, it's called Burning and Destroying All Before Them: Creeks and Seminoles on the Revolutionary Frontier. This shows the Creeks and the Seminoles were both attacking Georgians. Both of them were angry that the Georgians were taking and using their land and resources, and the natives thought that was theirs. I mean, it's common throughout all of American history that the natives did not like the fact that the Europeans came and took their land. But Georgia couldn't do much about it because they could not build up a military force. They were just there as a military buffer. They had the bare minimum there. But also during the war, the British were trying to get the Creeks and Seminoles to fight along their side. However, in that book that I just mentioned, no Seminoles marched from St. Augustine in 1778. None of them, and that really worried the General Campbell about. Well, they were promised this kind of this support, this help, and very few Creeks actually went along with the British as well. And we can see this as a turning point in the war for the British, and it was just a big 360. But from that beginning of that march in 1778 from St. Augustine, Robert Davis stated this was the beginning of a string of losses that would hurt the American cause. The American cause is going to be hurt. This was a part of the Southern strategy that the British came up with to try to go in at the Southern states and win each colony after another, each one by one, and gain the momentum that they needed to take on the middle colonies and the northern colonies. They needed this type of momentum. It was just that kind of simple. So this began to shift the experience in America. The British had to plan the attack on the south to start with Georgia and move north. And by the time the British would reach the northern colonies, the Americans would be willing to surrender because they've seen all their allies diminish. But as we know that this did not occur, we know that this did not happen, but the plan was working for the British, but only in the colony of Georgia. Georgia is a special colony, and this is something that I really thought was interesting whenever I was studying. Georgia was the only colony to have the royal governor reinstated after the start of the fighting. It was the only colony to have that royal governor set back over in Savannah. Georgia was still a relatively weak colony because of the reliance on Great Britain before. And in restored colony, Georgia's 1779 to 1782, that was the length of period that the colony of Georgia was restored, that the royal governor was back in charge of all of Georgia from Savannah. And it was really just to push forward and to move on that southern strategy that Britain had at this time. In February 1776, the royal governor was expelled from the colony. He had to go back to England, and he really wanted to come back. He really wanted to come back to Georgia and get what was his. And that occurred with South Carolina as well, but South Carolina never fell back to the British. But after the British recapture, the only colonial government of Georgia was reestablished. There was the only in all of the colonies. This recapture occurred in December 1778. This was just interesting to me that this is the first time that I've heard that Georgia was the only colony that had been retaken over by the British after everything had started, and I just thought that was interesting. But a few months later, on February 14th, 1779, one of the most important battles in the American Revolutionary War history, and Georgia history for that matter, occurred. It was called the Battle of Kettle Creek. It was fought in Wilkes County, about 12 miles from present-day Washington, Georgia. There was 400 force of the Americans, and they surprise attack and defeated a force of about 800 loyalists. This battle was so important and so it showed the determination of the Southern Patriots. It showed that they meant business and they wanted to stay in control of their own state and their own area. But I'm going to shift gears just for a moment. I wanted to touch on some African American history in Georgia during this time, and one of the websites that I looked at on NPS.gov, the section with African American in the Revolutionary Period states, of the Southern states, only Maryland permitted African Americans to enlist. In 1779, Congress offered slave masters in South Carolina and Georgia $1,000 each for each slave they provided to the army, but the legislature of both states refused the offer. Thus, the greatest number of African American soldiers in the American army came from the North, which is very interesting because I knew that there was a presence. I had taken African American history before, but I never really got down into the bare bones, the meat of the issues that was occurring. And that shows us that there wasn't much of an influence from Georgia, from the African Americans. And really what propelled forward was what we have today as Georgia history and revolutionary Georgia history. And it's a very interesting topic to look at, and definitely I wish I had more time to do it. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.